The following is a special video presentation of the Hennepin County Library.
Welcome to a discussion with mystery writer J.A. Jance. I'm Steve Benson. J.A. Jance's latest book is Lying in Wait. It's a J.P. Beaumont mystery. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
One of the things that's so delightful about this novel is that it's so rooted in the landscape of Seattle. There's Ballard, the old Scandinavian district. Space Needle fits in, even a trip outside to Gig Harbor. I want to talk a little bit about that and the fact that many mystery writers now are turning away from the big cities, New York, Los Angeles, and really rooting themselves in a community that they know.
I am a reality-based writer, and when I write mysteries, I'm always interested in what happens to the characters, how they react to the things that happen to them, what they say and do, and it's easier for me to have them do it in a place that's familiar to me. If I wanted to invent a universe, I would write science fiction. So the Beaumont books are set in Seattle. The Joanna Brady books are set in Arizona. I've spent half my life in both of those places. And so the landscape is part of the book, but it's sort of a physical framework and geographical framework for me to tell the story.
Do you think about the actual map of those places when characters move from one part of the city to the next?
I do more than think about the map. I do follow the map, but I also will get in the car and take a stopwatch at the hour of the day when the action is taking place to see exactly how long it takes to get from one spot to another. Or I try to make sure that if you're on a one-way grid somewhere, that you're going down forth rather than up it, or that kind of thing. It's important to have that accuracy, just not only for me, but also because I know the readers appreciate it.
And also you use the actual names of restaurants and clubs too.
As much as I can get away with. If I know that something bad is going to happen in a certain locale, I will check there. In the third book, Trial by Fury, corpse turns up in the dumpster outside a grocery store on Queen Anne. So I called the grocery store and I said, what would you think if I had a body turn up in your dumpster? And they said, no way. So I created a different grocery store on that spot. But when I can do it, I do it, and I enjoy that.
Do you think that audiences around the country are coming to appreciate now that they can look at a detective, say, who is in Cleveland or Atlanta, as well as a place like Seattle?
Well, think about how much we've learned from reading Dashiell Hammett or from reading John D. MacDonald about Florida, or the New York writers. I think that what's happened is the publishers have decided that there are more places than just 3 or 4 where you can live and write successfully. When I started doing this, the first Beaumont book came out in 1985, and I think the idea of regional mysteries was just sort of coming on the horizon, and now of course it's the in-crowd thing. But I know that those local audiences really appreciate having that stuff. And the other thing is people show up from out of town. In the Beaumont books, this is my Yeah Sure You Betcha Beaumont, because there's a lot of Scandinavian stuff in the background, but it's also my first post-Doghouse book. The Doghouse was a perfectly awful restaurant in Seattle that operated for 60 years and then just closed down the 31st of January of this year.
It was your book that helped close it down.
No, I don't think so. The way people eat these days contributed to the demise of a place where my husband used to say they fried everything, including the lettuce. But this is the first post-Doghouse book, because I figured if Seattle has to do without the Doghouse, so does J.P. Beaumont. And I know that people would turn up in Seattle and go into the bar at the Doghouse, order a McNaughton's, and say they came to see if Beau was there. And I have it on good authority that there was some graffiti in the men's restroom that used to say that Beau had been there. I personally have never seen him.
You also, in this one, write about, I think it's a non-alcoholic bar.
Yes, Club 449 is a bar that caters to people who are no longer drinking. It's a real bar. You go in there and there are darts and there's pool and there's cigarette smoke, but the happy hour is lattes. It has nothing to do with booze. There's no booze anywhere around. But still there's a real tavern atmosphere to it, and a lot of people who stop drinking are very comfortable in that kind of milieu. And if they're not drinking, they don't have any place else to go. So I'm glad Club 449 exists, and I'm glad that Lying in Wait is letting people know it's out there. My background is that I spent 20 years of my life with a man who died of chronic alcoholism at age 42, a year and a half after I divorced him. When I started writing the Beaumont books, you're supposed to write what you know, and Beau was kind of a maintenance drinker. He just drank some all the time. And I say that I didn't know my husband was a drunk until he started trying to sober up, and then I figured out he'd been drunk the whole time I knew him. But when I was doing a book signing of the fourth book, a lady came up to me at a book signing and said, "You know, Beau drinks every day. He has a drink of choice, and it's starting to interfere with his work. Does J.P. Beaumont have a problem?" And I said, "These are books." It was clear to me. But in the course of that set of signings, 6 other people asked me essentially the same question, and it finally got my attention, and I thought, alcoholism is a disease of denial. No wonder the author is the last person to figure it out. I've had people tell me, and so I decided that eventually Beau would do something about his drinking in the books, but I've had people tell me that as soon as they read the first book, they knew he had a drinking problem, and that eventually something would happen about it. But it's interesting that my readers saw that clearly when I didn't see it.
Well, one of the things that's so delightful about your books is the fact that you've fleshed out the character so much of Beaumont, and it continues to build. In this particular book, we find out more about his relationship with his grandmother. Actually, his grandfather dies in sort of a prologue. Mm-hmm. And we even catch a glimpse of his ex-wife, Karen, who has cancer now.
That part of the book was interesting to me because the book starts with Beau receiving an early morning phone call from his first wife's second husband. Now, in the world of blended families, a Saturday morning phone call from the second husband is not a sign of a good thing. And sure enough, Dave Livingston is calling to report that their mutual daughter, Kelly, who has always been kind of a problem child, ran away from home prior to both high school graduation and her 18th birthday. Now she's been located in a small town in Oregon, and a town called Ashland. And she's living with an actor and about to get married. Would Beau please do something to fix this problem? So in the book, Failure to Appear, he goes down to Oregon to try to fix that, and it's not entirely a fixable thing. In that book, while I was writing it, Beau was trying to be an adult about all of this, and he was trying to get through this family crisis without drinking. And Karen was being such a turkey, and I kept thinking, what in the world is the matter with her? And then at the end of the book, I found out what was the matter with her. So that is something that continues on into Lying in Wait. And I guess that's the wonderful thing about writing a series. You get to put more stuff in it than you would get to put in a single book. So not only does the author come to know the characters better, so do the readers.
Well, it sounds like with many writers, your characters take on a life of their own. You're directing them, but sometimes it appears as though the characters really are existing on another plane.
I have a new series the second book in that series just came out in the summer of '94. It's called Tombstone Courage. The first book came out in original paperback in '93, and that one was called Desert Heat. In that book, Joanna Brady is sort of an every woman. I see her as an every woman. She's happily married. She has a job in the insurance industry. She has a 9-year-old daughter who's a bit prickly on occasion. She has a troublesome mother, in-laws that she likes very much. Her husband, Andy, is a deputy sheriff, and he's a candidate for the office of sheriff. Unfortunately for him, I write murder mysteries, but he's not a long-term character. In the first part of that book, he is gravely injured, and he is airlifted from Bisbee, which is my hometown, to University Hospital in Tucson. Joanna Brady is a woman who goes to church. She sings in the church choir, and her best friend, Marianne McEllier, is also her pastor at church. So when Joanna is in the waiting room waiting to find out what happens to Andy, her best friend and pastor also shows up in the waiting room. The doctor comes out, he says, okay, he's come through surgery, he is heavily sedated, you're in this for the long haul, you better go someplace and get some sleep. And Joanna says, no, I'm gonna wait right here. Bring me a blanket, I'll sleep here in the waiting room. And Marianne McEllier says, if she's staying, I'm staying. A little while later, they turned off the lights, they bedded down, they're trying to go to sleep. And Joanna says, I'm trying to pray, but I can't remember the words. And Marianne says, well, trying to remember the words counts. God knows what you mean, but would you like me to pray for you? And Joanna says yes, and Marianne McEllier says, now I lay me down to sleep. And when she said that in the computer, I thought, oh, what a nice thing for her to say. Because it's like giving a hungry child a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. It is a gift from childhood. Mm-hmm. But as soon as I encountered that scene in the book, it seemed like Marianne said it. It didn't seem like I said it. But from then on, I felt like I had a real grasp of who those people were.
And what makes the books so delightful is that relationship that you see being built up between people. And also, because they're murder mysteries, you see very dysfunctional relationships as well.
Well, you see people in crisis. The 10th book is a book called Without Due Process, the 10th Beaumont book. And that book starts with a home invasion case where a Seattle police officer, his wife, 2 of their children, and a neighbor child are all murdered in their home. And one little kid escapes because he was hiding in the closet and fell asleep in there. So because the police officer was an African American, I thought, well, where's the funeral going to be? I'm always interested in where the funeral is going to be. And so I called a friend whose husband is the pastor of the Mount Zion Baptist Church in Seattle, which is a predominantly African American church, and asked Louise McKinney, what would you think? What would your parishioners think if I had a funeral happen in this church? And she said, well, I think it would be fine, but why don't you come to our church and see what it's like? And so my husband and I integrated the Mount Zion Baptist Church one Sunday morning and heard a wonderful sermon which is written into the background of that funeral. A few weeks ago, we had a tragedy in Seattle, which is not unlike the one that's being played out here, with a police officer who stopped to help some kids who were evidently stranded along the highway. What they were really planning was a carjacking. And the police officer died, and the funeral was at the Mount Zion Baptist Church, and it was just the way I had written it, and it really tore at my heart. It just the way I'm in town when this tragedy is occurring in St. Paul with the 2 officers.
Yes, in the summer of 1994 as we talk.
And so I'm seeing a replay of that, and what I'm always struck by is that there are real people who do this very tough job that J.P. Beaumont does. And I'm always gratified when police officers tell me they like my books. And I'm even more gratified when readers tell me that through reading about him, they've learned that police officers are people.
And in your novels, I call them novels as well as mysteries.
They're stories.
There is that sense that all of these are events that could take place just down the block.
Yes, because that's true. They could happen. They could happen anywhere. And in the Joanna Brady books, of course, I'm dealing with a small town milieu in Seattle. It's a large town, but as you know, it's divided up into neighborhoods. So in those neighborhoods, it's really a small town too. When I first moved to Seattle, we lived in what my kids called the dental regrade, and we shopped on Lower Queen Anne. And one morning I took my son to soccer, and then we went to the grocery store, and everywhere we went we saw people we knew, and he said, "Why is this happening? I thought Seattle was supposed to be a big city." But yes, there is the plausibility that it could happen here.
And in this novel as well, Sue is a detective. She's also a single mother.
Yes, with a really bratty kid. And boy, anybody who has raised 14-year-old males knows what Sue Danielson is up against.
You also have a blended family, too.
I have a blended family, yes. At the grand opening signing for Until Proven Guilty in 1985, the week before, I had met a man whose first wife had died of breast cancer on the same day of the year as my husband died of alcoholism, only 2 years apart. When we discovered we had that day in common, the 1st of January, that was enough for us to strike up a conversation. And 6 months later, to the dismay of all 5 of our adolescent children, we got married. So most of the books have been written in a household with a husband, kids, dogs, chaos. I'm always amused when people say...
Plenty of material for future books.
Oh, yes. In fact, in book number 7, that starts with Beau receiving, again, an early morning phone call about a case in progress, and he goes to answer the phone, and his fingers won't work because they're in splints, and he can't remember exactly how his fingers got in splints. So he spends the rest of the book trying to solve the mystery, but also trying to find out what happened to his fingers, because he can't exactly ask somebody, well, how did I hurt my fingers, without admitting that he was functioning in a blackout when that happened.
I want to shift to your novel set in the Southwest, Hour of the Hunter. And I understand that you were a librarian in that period in your life, and I want to ask about Native American storytelling.
I was a librarian because in 1962, when I went to the University of Arizona and wanted to be a writer, I was told, boys become writers, girls become teachers. So I became first a teacher and then a librarian. But I was on the Papago, which is now the Tohono O'odham. The Papago took back their traditional name, which means the desert people. I was there for 5 years, and I told 26 stories a week in K through 6 classrooms. Some of the stories I learned are Native American legends, and those are woven into the background of Hour of the Hunter. But it's really a psychological thriller. It's the story of a convicted killer who gets out of prison and goes looking for the 2 women who put him away 6 years earlier. When I was trying to write that book, I had written it once and it was a very bad book and it never sold. The first book is always the hardest one to sell. It had a good title, but it was a very bad book. So when they offered to make Hour of the Hunter my first hardback, I said, well, I'll sell you that book, but only if I rewrite it. So I started trying to figure out who the characters were, and I did fine until I got to the bad guy, and I couldn't figure out who the bad guy was, which threw me into my worst ever case of writer's block. It was so bad that when my University of Arizona alumni magazine came, I read the whole thing from cover to cover. Now this is
That's bad.
writer's block,
That's bad.
right? And there, right before the obituaries, was this little boxed-in article that said the newly reconstituted creative writing program at the University of Arizona was just going swimmingly. So I turned to my second husband, the nice man, and said, you know, I graduated from there and I have all of these books out. It's all these years later, maybe they would like me to come down and be writer in residence for a semester in the Sun. He said, call him up, ask him. I sold life insurance for 10 years. I am not afraid of making a little cold call. So I called them up and asked them, and the young man I spoke to on the phone said to me, and I quote, "Oh, we don't do anything with genre fiction here. We only do literary fiction." Well, it was a miracle. I was cured of writer's block on the spot. And the convicted killer in Hour of the Hunter turns out to be a former professor of creative writing from the University of Arizona.
Sweet revenge. Huh?
And my first husband, the rat, does make a cameo appearance in that book. He's dead at the beginning of the book. But Hour of the Hunter is the story of a woman who is teaching on the reservation, but her soul burns to be a writer. And her husband, like mine, does tell her in the course of the book. My husband told me in 1968, there's only going to be one writer in our family, and I'm it.
Tell us about the Native American tradition of telling stories to hold back the dark.
The Papago stories, the Tohono O'odham stories, are winter-telling tales. They're not to be told in the spring and summer when the snakes and lizards are out, because if a snake or lizard overhears the story, he can swallow the storyteller's luck and bring him harm. And most Native American, the Raven stories are like that. The other Native Americans who have coyote stories are like that.
The tricksters?
The tricksters, sure. And they're told in the winter because that's the time when there's the least amount of food, it's cold, it's hungry out, and you sit around and tell stories to hold the night back. People tell me that they have encountered my books when they've been in crisis with medical emergencies, either when they themselves have been the patient or when they've had a loved one who is. And someone will bring them the stack of books numbered in chronological order, and they'll read through the whole set. And I'm always so complimented by that, because the ancient sacred charge of the storyteller is to beguile the time. And that's how I see myself. Not as a mystery writer, and certainly not anything so highfalutin as a novelist, but as a teller of tales.
And presumably with an ongoing character like J.P. Beaumont or your female detective, then those stories have a life of their own and a momentum carrying them into the future.
They seem to be. I have just finished writing J.P. Beaumont number 12. Lying in Wait is number 12. 13 through 17 are sold but not written. I'm finishing Shoot, Don't Shoot, which is Joanna Brady number 3. And 4 and 5 are sold but not written. And I will also be writing a sequel to Hour of the
Does that ever give you any anxiety to know that they're sold but not written?
Well, the anxiety comes when I'm on tour with the last of the book that should be done right now, not quite finished and lurking, partially done in my computer. It will be done probably within the next week and a half.
I'm intrigued by the titles that you've chosen. Many writers say that titles are almost the most difficult part. Sometimes writers don't even have control of the titles.
For years, I sold my books. Until Proven Guilty was the first and only book that was completely written at the time it was sold. Then they would say, okay, we're ready for another book. Can you come up with any titles? So I'd come up with a title, and then they'd buy I'd come up with 2 titles, and they'd buy 2 books, and I'd go along on my way. When they finally started buying Untitled Beaumont number so-and-so, I started feeling like I had finally arrived. Tombstone Courage. My editor called one day, and he said, okay, we're having the title meeting. This was on a Thursday afternoon. He said, we're having the cover meeting for the second Joanna Brady book. I need a title. I said, John, I haven't started writing that book yet. Well, he said, can't you come up with a title? And I said, how long do I have? He said, well, the meeting isn't until Tuesday. Well, that weekend I was a panelist for a writers' conference down in Oregon. I went down there, and one of my fellow panelists was a man by the name of Pierce Brooks. Pierce Brooks was a homicide detective with the LAPD in the late 60s and early 70s. He worked with Joseph Wamba on the Onion Fields case. He was offended by the number of police officers who were dying in the line of duty. So he wrote a book called Officer Down Code 3, which is a case study treatment of the 10 fatal errors that police officers make. That book is still used in police officer training courses to this day, even though it came out in 1973 or 74. But it's not a book you can go into Walden's or Dalton's and buy. It's a book you have to look for to find. And at this conference, they had a copy of it. And I wanted to know what my fellow panelists did, so I bought a copy and went upstairs to read it during our free time before the banquet. Thumbing through it, I went through the list of the 10 fatal errors. And number 8 was tombstone courage, which in police parlance means failure to call for backup. People who know Joanna Brady is set in Arizona, and more specifically in Cochise County, which is also the location of Tombstone, the Tome Too Tough to Die, assume that Tombstone Courage is a book about Tombstone. It is actually a book about failure to call for backup. But police officers, when they see that title, know what the book is about.
This novel, part of it takes place in Ballard. Where can we expect JP to show up in the next one?
I think the next book is going to have something to do with Tacoma. Now, you have to understand, I haven't started writing that book. But Tacoma is an interesting place that I know very little about. And doing research on a book is a way of learning about it.
Just down the road.
But the other thing, someone said to me the other day, you know, we haven't heard anything from Ron Peters' wife since the second book.
Let's look for that. We have to close now. I want to thank you very much for joining us today. And we're talking today with J.A. Jance, whose latest book is Lying in Wait.
Thank you.
A presentation of the Hennepin County Library.